Thank you. A warm welcome to all of you and at this time of the day. But I know that you are also interesting because here we gather to explore one of the most critical challenges in global public health, our capacity of confront the unknown. And for this, we have a distinguished panel of international experts that will decode disease X concept and will guide also through the intricate landscape of pandemic preparedness, from advancing in global disease surveillance to strategic and collaborative approach that are required to stay ahead of the emerging threat. And right now, I'll pass to my colleague Angeliki to introduce the speakers.
Thank you very much, Luísa, and a warm welcome from my side. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers for today, for this plenary. Our first speaker is Dr. Maria Henao-Restrepo. Maria serves as a technical lead for the R&D blueprint for epidemics at the Health Emergencies Program in WHO. And she has extensive experience in the field. She has worked with the Ebola research and development team. She served as the global focal point for measles and rubella control efforts and worked for the polio elimination strategies as well. So our second speaker is Professor Mika Salminen. He is the Director General of the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. He previously led the public health initiatives responsible for the Finnish vaccination programs, surveillance systems, and reference laboratories, and he also played a very important role during the COVID pandemic, leading the response efforts at the Public Health Institute in Finland. And last but not least, our third speaker is Professor Christian Drosten. Christian is a director of the Institute of Virology at Charité University in Berlin. And together with his team, he has focused a lot on his research on virus discovery and developing molecular diagnostic tools. He has co-discovered SARS coronavirus, worked with MERS and SARS-CoV-2, and for SARS-CoV-2 specifically, they also developed, himself and his team, the first diagnostic test that was used and approved by WHO and used globally. So a lot of expertise here with our three speakers, and thank you very much for joining us. And before we start, just to mention that there will be a Q&A after the presentations, and please, as you have been doing since yesterday, either post your questions at the Skyde app, or when time comes, you can also raise your hand, and there is a mic in the middle of the room, and you can also speak up. Thank you very much, and Luísa, please.
Yeah, so please, Maria, I invited you to explain this concept of disease X and also how should you approach this concept. So many thanks for...
Okay, so good afternoon and buenas tardes. I am very happy to be here and share with you, and I thank the organizers for inviting WHO to this event. So I want to talk about something really important, how to prepare for the next pandemic. So to do that, I'm going to walk through a metaphor, because the first question we have to ask ourselves is, which pathogen will cause the next pandemic? Which one? So when we look at it in WHO with about 250 experts, we figured out that there were about 1,650 pathogens that could turn to be the next pathogen X, the next pathogen that caused the pandemic. So are we going to have 1,650 research and development programs globally? Is that what we are going to do? So I am going to use a metaphor to explain to you how we approach this. So this metaphor is a simple one. It's the metaphor of the drunken man who lost the keys under the street light. So the first place where the drunken man is going to look for the keys, the lost keys, is in the lighted area around the street lamp. But that represents for us the priority pathogens, these ones that we already know well about, that they can cause a threat, that we have documented, and we are all working on research and development programs. But we could expand the lighted area by looking into the prototype pathogens. These pathogens that we select not because they will cause the next pandemic necessarily, or because they are virulent and pathogenic today, because they transmit from human to human fast, but because they have attributes that people like Christian Drosten will like to use to develop antigens and develop medical contrameasures. They are very important to learn about the characteristics of the pathogens in that family. But this is not enough. In the dark area, there are the other pathogens, the ones we don't know that could emerge anywhere. This is the pathogen X, the one that can surprise us to a certain extent, because there are many of them that we know that if they experience mutations, if there are changes in the biology, if there are changes in the environment and the vectors, they could become more efficient to transmit from person to person, maybe more virulent, can cause more severe disease. So what we are proposing in WHO is we work on all the viral families, on all the critical viral families, regardless of the information we have today about the perceived risk of causing the next pandemic. Basic research, basic surveillance, and I'm sure Christian is going to speak more about that and how important it is. And it looks like crazy. Why are we going to invest on this? Because this is what is going to give us the key to be well prepared for medical contrameasures in the future. We are also saying that to keep the research and development machinery, our interest, the scientists, to address the problems of today, we have to work also on the priority pathogens, those that causes diseases. So if I am in Latin America, the flavivirus are very important for me. If I am in Africa, the filoviruses and the arenaviruses are very important for me. That's what drives the thing. And finally, we are proposing that we should have the development of medical contrameasures, learning for prototype pathogens, how to, for example, use platforms, or how to select antigens, or how the viruses in that family enter into the cell, so that we can develop ways of protecting ourselves against that. And then finally, for pathogen X, whatever we do, it's probable that we are not going to have in a vial the vaccine or the therapeutic that will address the problems of the next pandemic. But if we do all these other preparations, all this other research, we will be able to switch around. And we were very lucky during COVID, as you all know, and this is why we have the vaccine soon. But how can we be lucky again? We have to build our own luck. So moving forward, we have 29 viral families, 269 to 250 experts from countries all around the world discussing which virus and which bacteria could be of concern. And through that, we selected 12 that we call the priority families. These families are families that already contain a priority pathogen, one that we already know can cause the next pandemic, at least one of them. And then after that, and I have to say, we also work on bacteria this time. Normally, we were focused only on viruses, but there were arguments for some of the bacteria. I just want to mention Yersinia pestis as an example of a bacteria that still is around, still causes problems in several countries, and that we should address. And so how do we go about? For each of the viral families that were priorities, we identified which ones were the priority pathogens within that viral family. And then, with more work, with a lot of more deliberations, we identified the prototype pathogens. Why I say with more deliberations? Because choosing prototype pathogens is more difficult. As I told you, it is not based on the virulence or the ability to transmit. It is based on a lot of different characteristics the virus have that can help that virus to become a prototype for the entire viral family. But then we select that. The other thing that we noted is that all these that are highlighted are the ones we have identified as priority pathogens in WHO in the previous decade. So we were very ambitious and I think very credulous, thinking that with 10 we will survive the next pandemic. We were lucky, but now we know that we have to have a broader perspective. And then there are also viral families like for HIV, AIDS, and malaria, polio, and others, for which there are global programs that we should consider. So now, moving on into this, people say, well, that's not my problem. You know, I don't have arenaviruses here because I am in Latin America, but there are the new world arenaviruses. So we want people researchers to understand that the collaboration is critical, that if you really just focus on local solutions, you may be short-sighted. That if you just address the issues of your local area or your region, like in the case of the European Union, you may miss some of the scientific knowledge that is being generated for viruses in the same family elsewhere. And in my graph, you can see that on one side is the priority pathogens, the other side is the prototype pathogens, and I highlighted the European Union. You see, you share a lot of the viruses with other regions of the world. So there is a lot for collaboration that should be said. We don't come from nothing. There have been lots of researchers and developers working on developing candidate medical contrameasures for some of these priority pathogens, but the pipeline is still small. We want to acknowledge their efforts, but we know that we need more options, and we also need to have broader spectrum vaccines and broader spectrum antivirals, and learn more about the small molecules and work on monoclonal antibodies. So the pipeline is there, and we have to make it richer together. So how do we put this together? Because she's talking about this large, ambitious program, 1,650 virus, 12 families. Wow, this sounds like science fiction. Well, the thing is not. We think that it's important to work like this because there is another element to this conversation that is critical, is the issue of equitable access to research. So when I have the honor of participating in the member states' deliberations about the pandemic treaty, equity is very important. But equity sometimes is reduced as, can I have a percentage of the doses you produce? But really, the important part of equity is equity in access to the knowledge, equity in participation as equal peers in the research and development efforts. And these networks that we are promoting, these big viral family works, have that as a point. Also, it's critical to say that many people talk about the speed, 100 days, 1 week, 15 days. We think speed is important, but quality, equity, cause, and trust in the communities is equally important. So now, how the corks are going to be organized. So you have to learn about this name because it's going to stick around, I promise you. The corks are collaborative open research consortium. So I am from Colombia, but I am Swiss. In Switzerland, the president is not above everybody. The president is primus inter pares, one among their peers. So in the corks function, the hub, the center, the research institution that will be the hub for the cork will be like the president of Switzerland, primus inter pares, and they will collaborate with all the other experts in the different viral families. And this collaboration is for what? It's for two things critical. The first one is to identify the knowledge gaps and the research priorities together, and to work and look at which ones have been unfunded. And the second is to work on the development of the tools, the core protocols, the target product profiles, the support and prioritization in the context of outbreaks. And I just want to say we have already 12 institutions that have signed off to being hubs for corks, at least one in Europe. So the other thing that the corks will do is we'll have a A to Z approach to research preparedness. So they will start from a smart surveillance, and I am not talking much because I know you are going to hear better explanations, to the implementation of clinical trials in the context of outbreaks using core protocols. So as you can see, it's not about protocols, it's not about regulations, it's not about putting candidate vaccines in the vial. It's in building the capacity across the system in an open, collaborative way so that we can be prepared really for this uncertainty of which pathogen will cause the next pandemic. And then during outbreaks, the scene changes. You know what happens during outbreaks? Everybody has a candidate medical contrameasure. Everybody thinks their protocol is the best. and everybody is friends with the minister or the president of the country affected by the outbreak. And then we have problems, because what we want as scientists and public health officials is that the best or the most suitable medical countermeasures are evaluated first. You remember during COVID, all the things that were tested, perhaps if there was a process, some of them will not have made it to trials. And we want the best protocols. You remember during COVID how many small protocols were conducted, thousands of them even in Europe, that didn't lead to any answers for public health. So we really need to have this open, transparent discussion, scientific among peers, of what is the best protocols. We need to also ensure that the medical countermeasures who are in the vials, the candidates, they are available for the trials to be tested, and we need to ensure that we have mechanisms for the funding and the liability issues. So we have worked on all of this with several partners, and just want to show an example here. So to prove this is not science fiction, you know about the filoviruses. So they were causing outbreaks, small outbreaks, and it was always a bit, let's say, disorganized in the context of outbreaks. So in 2022, we call all the researchers and developers that work on filoviruses, and they together decided that we should create a consortium with a roadmap, and a consortium with protocols, and a consortium that meets to discuss the critical research questions, that talks to each other when there is outbreaks. And this is how Marburg, that now is going to turn into the filovirus viral family, was created. And now we have core protocols for therapeutics and core protocols for evaluation of vaccines that have been discussed openly with everybody. And we have an independent committee that looks at the candidates with clear criteria that everybody knows about. That's the aim for all the viral families, that we have these open and transparent scientific discussions that are not the politics of who are you friends with, which helps, at least in my country. Okay? And so this is the list of the institutions who have already mentioned to WHO that they would like to participate in our corks and take the lead. And as you can see, there are institutions from the south and from the north. We have still some viral families that are orphans, so I hope after this discussion, you will write to me and say that your institution wants to help host at least one viral family. And I want to thank all the thousands of scientists. And before I leave you, I just want to say that we don't start from nothing. In our previous approach, focusing on priority pathogens, we made lots of progress with thousands of scientists who contributed to the deliberations. We have roadmaps for many of the priority pathogens. We have target product profiles and protocol designs. But now our challenge is to move that from an individual pathogen to a viral family. So we think that we can achieve it. I think this is my last slide. We can do it if we work in viral families, not in one pathogen alone. And I am not saying you should not work in your favorite pathogen, but you should work on it with a broader view, with an interconnected view, with thinking about how you can, what is the word that I'm supposed to use here? How can you use across the viral family all the learnings in translational research so that we improve. And then also we think that collaboration with the countries across, in the south and in the north, is critical for the viral family approach to move. And finally, that's the only way that when the next pandemic comes, we have equity in access, equity in knowledge, and trust from the community. So thank you very much, and I hope that you are convinced after this that working together is the solution, and that the scientific community gave an example during COVID of collaboration. Not all the politicians did the same, so we really have this responsibility of doing it again. Thank you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Anna Maria. This is really quite interesting, and you will have, for sure, several questions at the end of this session. But right now, I would like that if you can develop a little bit about this cork, if they are already established, and what was the process, or what is the process for the establishment of these corks?
So, thank you. The corks are called collaborative, open, with capital open, research consortium. And open means there is not closed club. There is no people who belongs to the network and people who doesn't. It's open to everybody who wants to come for a meeting or for all the meetings. We know that there will be a core group that stays there. They are going to work under the framework that we have in WHO, that is the WHO collaborating centers. So there is a framework, a legal framework, towards which WHO and the collaborating center agree to delegate some of the functions of WHO in an organized way with a work plan each year. The first task of every cork will be to invite the community to start discussing the research and development roadmaps. And the first calls of the corks are already happening. And by the end of this month, 12 corks will have the initial call. And if you don't know about it and you have interest, please contact us. And we hope that the corks will continue to discuss. For example, how do you develop the correlates of protection for this family? Or how do you establish the smart surveillance that is required in certain parts of the world? Or how do you choose antigens for vaccines? Or how do you go about sharing information on monoclonal antibodies? And each cork will choose different questions, and they will debate them. Some of the corks start higher up and more advanced, like the filovirus, where we are now more focused on the R&D part and the medical countermeasures, thanks to the work of many researchers. Others, for example, in the Bunia viralis, will start from very basics. And for the bacteria, for example, Yersinia pestis, there will be more emphasis on the medical countermeasures and so on. So we are not prescribing. We are inviting the scientific community to help us drive the debates.
Many thanks. So please, your questions, use the app and we can discuss them at the end of the session. And right now I'll invite Mika to talk about pandemic preparedness.
Thank you very much. So, chairs, co-presenters, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and honor to be here to talk to you about things that many of you probably also know at least as much as me, or maybe probably some even more. Anyway, I just asked a question here in the first slide. What does it take if we want to have pandemic preparedness, and what does it actually mean? So I think this cycle is familiar to many of you. Preparedness actually is not something that you do and then you have it and that's it, and then you let it sit until you actually use it. You have to actually maintain it all the time. And the cycle starts with identifying and understanding risks. Then you plan what you should do to mitigate those risks or prevent those risks from actually happening. Then you have to train people to actually be able to perform the tasks that are necessary. And then if everything goes well and there is no crisis, you exercise, and that is really important. If you don't exercise, don't expect your plans to work. And also, actually, don't expect you to be able to foresee everything that happens, because the first thing to learn about pandemic preparedness or preparedness in general is that you will always be also surprised by events, and everything that you have planned will not necessarily work. Now, if you have an event or a crisis or an outbreak or actually a pandemic, then you should actually have an after-action assessment and revise your plans and correct them. And this is something actually I'm still waiting for in a very sort of broad sense from the previous pandemic. I don't think we have finished that assessment. It's too late to prepare if you start to doing it when the actual event happens. Also, it is very important to understand that this is like maintaining a defense force. You have to support it for the long run. It's not something that you can do for 3 years and then you're happy for the next 20. You actually have to maintain the structures. So in Finland, we have several levels. Using Finland as an example, of course. One goes all the way up to the government, to the Prime Minister's office and to all the ministries. So each time a new government comes into action, they produce something which is called the Strategy for Securing the Functions Vital to Society. And this is basically a very sort of top-level preparedness plan, which outlines the responsibilities of each of the sectors, also the private sector and the CSOs or NGOs. Who does what, who has responsibility for what, and how should they collaborate on a very top level. So that's what happens every 4 years. The current government is just finishing their new revision. The one that we have is from 2017, and it was actually helpful during the pandemic. One important thing to remember is that usually it's very difficult to have sort of a specialized function that takes over when a crisis hits or a pandemic starts. You can, in principle, have it if you're very, very rich and you just do exercises all the time. This is the model which is used for defense forces, of course. Defense force is most useful if you never have to use it. If there is no war, that's the best outcome. And basically, you should think about pandemic preparedness in the same way, which means that you have to invest in it. But it's still necessary to have the actual actors that work in the field of health and prevention, public health, actively engaged also in peacetime. This is a more elaborate sort of description of the threat models, and you can see that there's a global level, there's a societal level, there's an individual level in the strategy, and then there are various sort of threats that are identified and how to mitigate those and how to prevent them and how to deal with them if they actually happen. If we look at the critical components of preparedness, and here we are talking about pandemic preparedness, this is some of the critical capacities. I actually tried to find a very current version of both the WHO and the ECDC, and they're a little bit outdated, to be honest. There are some updates to sort of parts of it, but we don't have a comprehensive new plan. I think the WHO's is the newest one, but I think that the ECDC's is over 10 years old, so that's definitely not enough. So there's some work for them to do. One of the things that is important is that you have to, the preparedness requires multiple existing systems and capabilities that can be mobilized and scaled up according to requirements of the particular case. Some investment in unlikely to be used resources is necessary. This means stockpiling. And here it's the same. If you never have to use the stockpile, that's actually great. So the politicians should not be afraid of things that actually go old or go bad. Some things you can recycle in the normal sort of operations, but not all. So expired materials, that's actually a good thing because we didn't need to use them. The other thing is that you have to know what happens. Of course, we have the ECDC, we have WHO on a global level who will keep us aware, but you have to have it locally also. And I think the example that I will describe to you will show you that you should not expect that the bad thing happens somewhere else. It might happen just there where you live. And therefore, you have to have a system of monitoring. That means surveillance. You have to have a system that actually assesses the situation, identifying health threats. And you have to have a process for risk assessment and anticipation. For the actual situation, you have to be able to communicate and collaborate. And you have to be able to do early warnings. So for the early warnings, we have both the EWR system in Europe, and we have the IHR notifications on a global level. But you have to ensure that you actually have that function in your country and that people know about it when something unusual happens. Now, how do we prevent a pandemic? This is a bit maybe overstating the situation, but this is an experience from a zoonotic attempt that we experienced in Finland about a year ago. It was high pathogenic avian influenza, H5N1, among farmed foxes, minks and raccoon dogs in Finland, which really scared us about a year ago. Now, mustelids, which the minks are sort of, in a way, optimal platforms for viral pandemics because the receptor distribution in the respiratory tract of minks is similar to humans. They are susceptible to several human pathogens, including seasonal avian and swine influenza viruses. They're bred in dense populations, which are poorly protected by biosecurity measures. They are very poorly protected. It's not like rearing chickens, which has very high biosecurity. It's very different. This means that there is a risk of reassortment and mammalian adaptation. And legislation for fur animal farming is often less strict than for livestock because it's not food. So that's basically the reason. So fur farming in Finland, there are about 550 fur farms, or there's a little bit less now. And they rear minks, foxes and raccoon dogs for production of fur. 95% of them are located in Ostrobothnia, which is on the western coastline in western Finland. It's a highly Swedish-speaking area also. And in July 2023, there were reports of signs of disease and increased death among animals. And then veterinary studies confirmed that this was caused by high pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 with the clade 2334B, and transmission was likely from seagulls. We had several deaths of seagull populations in the country, as was the case in the rest of Europe also. At this stage, also mammal-to-mammal transmission could not be ruled out, and we had a high public health concern. Do we have the perfect sort of breeder for creating a H5N1 type virus that could transmit easily between humans? So what did we do? One of the key issues is that we have a very long-standing collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture and the Food Safety Agency, who is also dealing with veterinary outbreaks. And we have a zoonotic center, which is a platform for discussion about risks that are zoonotic in origin. And we have a meeting which happens every week where they are also engaged dealing with epidemics and outbreaks. So we started epidemiological investigations looking at the minks. You have to understand that it's not like, okay, we are testing the minks all the time and we find an influenza there. The readout is actually that they die more often than normal. So the mortality went up, and that's how this was discovered actually. But after that, of course, we could start testing. We made a lot of guidance to try to prevent this from spreading. In the end, we also used vaccinations. I'll come back to that. We created reporting from the areas, and we started thinking about potential for patient care. These are main things. There's a lot of other things. You can see the sort of regions that were affected by this event. Outbreak management, we have several key actors. It's us, we are the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. We are the public health sort of actors on the national level. The Finnish Food Authority, which is the animal health authority, the ministries that are above us, but also municipalities and also regions that are taking care of the healthcare system. And we had also the the farmers' organization FIFUR, the Finnish Fur Breeders Association. All of these took part in thinking about what we should do. This is a schematic on how information was transferred. As you can see, data was collected locally. It was tested by a public laboratory, informed then, of course, the healthcare system, because based on our guidance, people were referred to the healthcare system for assessment and then testing. Then information flows back to us through an electronic system, which is a generic system. It was not set up for this. It works for all notifiable diseases, of which one is high pathogenic avian influenza. We also, that's the reporting that goes there, and then based on this information where we saw a new farm affected, we provided support for the healthcare system from us, and then to the veterinary side of things from the Food Safety Agency. And there are those organizations again. So important things that we had to deal with was identification and testing of exposed people. So people who actually run these farms, they of course handle the animals all the time. There are veterinarians, there are food or feed distributors. So all of those were considered exposed unless they had used the proper PPE, which we only were able to advise on when the thing already was going on. Looking at various evidence to provide the recommendations for the public, healthcare actors, stakeholders, the farmers. Looking at the viral evolution, so we did a lot of sequencing with some help from both European colleagues and also in-house. Looking at the actual virus, which was very similar to the one that was found in seagulls in the area. And you have to understand that the sort of distribution of food in these facilities is not like very hygienically organized. It's basically a sort of a very protein-rich porridge, which is just put on the in front of the animals, and there's a lot of spillage, which means that it gathers lots of birds, among other things that are looking for food. Vaccinations were used in the end also. First, we recommended influenza vaccination, regular seasonal influenza vaccination, with the rationale that we want to minimize the risk of reassortment. And then later on also, through a European Union mechanism, we had access to an H5N1 vaccine, which is offered to those who are at risk. We looked at exposed people. These are just some statistics on how many people were identified as potentially exposed. In the end, 406 cases were actually tested, both by PCR and then various serological methods, a subset of them. We found no positives among human cases. So that's a very good result, of course. But there were many farms that were affected. And we were quite worried that it just needs one exposure that leads to a virus that has adapted or reassorted and starts spreading easily between people. Luckily, that did not happen. We had enhanced influenza A surveillance, so we sensitized the healthcare system so that they would look for influenza, especially in the region, so that they would pick up and also refer for testing, not just based on knowledge, but based on the symptomatic profile. No unusual influenza viruses were detected, luckily. Here's a sort of summary of what actually happened. The sequencing showed that there were several initial introductions, 3, 4 at least, maybe more. But it's also very evident that the virus must have spread between the animals in the facilities. These are not small facilities. There are hundreds and thousands of animals there. All to all, it's about 500,000 animals every year which are produced, mainly foxes and mink. It's very likely that they spread between the animals and also between farms. What the mechanism there is still not clear. It could also be the birds separately, but that seems a bit unlikely because 72 farms were eventually affected and over 500 persons exposed. All the animals eventually on the affected farms were culled. That means destroyed. This is the way that it's handled in the veterinary sector. And when this was first proposed in the summer of 23, and we discussed with the Ministry of Agriculture, they said that, well, we have the problem that it's not in the statutes that there will be a compensation for this kind of animals. If it would be chickens, it would be there. So it's summer, we can't do it. And I pointed out to them that, well, you know, if a pandemic starts in Finland, it's not going to look very good that you didn't want to do it in the summer. And next week we had the statute. So this is not cheap. The societal costs, the direct costs in budgetary means, so there's many other costs, were over 50 million as farmer compensation. Now, I could have used that 50 million for some other purposes also, but of course, these are private entrepreneurs and they need to have their livelihood. The successes here are that we had a joint cross-sectoral response. We met every week with a team from our side and a team from the side of the veterinary authorities. The epidemic was contained. We didn't have any epidemics this year. There was an increased sensitization of healthcare. The testing worked. There were no human cases. That's the main thing from our point of view. We got some new legislation improving the biosecurity a little bit on the farms. Not enough, but still some. Challenge is we didn't have all the platforms that we would have needed for exchanging information. We had to build some of them. We didn't have sort of pre-made guidelines or protocols. We had things that we could implement and develop further. I think that's reality because you cannot think about every single sort of case in the future. The harder thing is that if you talk to the agriculture sector or the human health sector, there are different priorities. In the agriculture sector, it's protection of the livelihood and the stocks. In the human sector, it's protection of human life. So it's a little bit different. Of course, they acknowledge the human life issue, but it's still like this, and you have to, acknowledge that. The other thing is that the vaccine uptake among the persons at risk, the workers and the veterinarians is actually very poor for the H5N1. We had the possibility to vaccinate 10,000 people, and recent review shows that only 450 took the vaccine. So we have lots to do there. Lessons learned: One Health coordination is vital. We need to work out the common objectives very early so that we don't get stuck with them. Also on the political level, because this became, of course, political quickly, like all public health eventually becomes if it's big enough. But there is an epilogue, and I'll finish here. In Finland, it's possible to put in citizens' initiatives to the parliament on legislation. And there is such an initiative at the moment which proposes that the farming of fur animals should stop, and that should be phased out with some compensation to those who do it. But the government has not been very keen to do that. So we, on our own sort of accord and as part of our own legislation, made a proposal to the parliament that fur farming, due to the potential risk of creation of a pandemic, constitutes a too high threat to human life and health on both national and global level and should be discontinued. And we also think that this should be brought up on an EU level because there are other countries that also do this. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking your time a little bit.
Many thanks. It was really comprehensive. Also, your thoughts about the preparedness for pandemic, and also your example that this is a case that was also dealt with very effectively. We have right now to skip the question that I had to you right now, but at the end of session, for sure that we'll have opportunity for coming back to this question. So right now, please, Angeliki, to introduce Christian.
Thank you very much. But before, maybe very quickly on the ECDC plans for the preparedness that Mika mentioned, just to say that there is a lot of ongoing work as part of the new ECDC mandate and the regulation on serious cross-border health threats. So then countries need to update their pandemic preparedness plans, and ECDC is very much involved in supporting the countries. So there is a lot of ongoing work and hands-on also work with the member states in EUA about this as we speak. So a lot to come, and maybe some more updates next year at the SkyDay on how this process is ongoing. So thank you very much, Mika, and I would like to then introduce Christian and invite him to talk about rapid response when a pathogen starts to spread widely in the community, so causing a pandemic. So Christian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks for having me. This is a very nice auditorium, actually, many people here. So I'm a clinical virologist in between public health and basic virology. I have a foot in some doors, and I've been asked to speak about responding to disease X, and I've brought something here that was not mentioned yet. So Anna Maria has addressed all the WHO blueprint activities. There is parallel work, of course, in organizations like CEPI, the 100 Days mission, to, within short time, make a vaccine, basically, and provide a vaccine. And there are other initiatives around, but this is not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is detection. So we have to acknowledge that the first detection of pandemic agent will be in a group of patients. So birds, bats, and I don't know what's out there in the jungle contains viruses. But we will not stop the first pandemic there, the next pandemic. We won't even detect it. Also, there seems to be let's say, a disbalance in our perception of risks regarding these sources of viruses, but then also the necessary attention to livestock or captive wildlife surveillance, as just presented with the example of flu in Finland. Then we have epidemic intelligence structures that are being established, that are being amended and expanded, like the WHO Hub for Pandemic and Epidemic Intelligence. Then HERA in the EU, the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, and ECDC per se with its mechanisms. And we should keep in mind that pathogen-specific intelligence and response will always have to include the academic research community, because these national or international public health structures can be powerful, but they have to take the research community on board, because it's just more powerful as a whole. It's just vast. ECDC coordinates a whole number of networks, like EVD LabNet that's been phased out, but then there are several COVID-19 and influenza-related networks. There is the EU reference laboratories mechanism coming up, being installed now. And we have initiatives on the national and European level in the research field, like the HERA Durable Network. This is a network of research entities across the EU, also dedicated to pandemic preparedness research, to early responses. And then This is just an example, a national example from Germany, the German Center for Infection Research, doing from a basic research background, translational research that also involves, of course, medical countermeasures against pandemics. Now, how did this practically come about? We have a time scale here of January 2020, and what we see is that on 10th of January, a genome was released. On 13th, 14th of January, WHO publishes the first protocol version of a diagnostic test on their homepage. All of this comes out of basic research. It's not possible to make such a test within 3 days, and in fact, we took speed much earlier. We somehow put serious work into this when we had the message, the intelligence, as we would now say, about the identity of this virus, the proposed identity, and then we were able to sample from known knowledge, from known diversity knowledge. So these are trees of coronaviruses before SARS-1 in 2003, and then 10 years after. And you see how these trees are populated. You see how a new virus here, SARS-1, is sitting on a very long branch. Is for this reason very difficult to discover at that time in the past. It's sitting here in the nowadays more populated tree. Here is the MERS virus, a new one that is already sitting on a known branch. This branch wasn't known 10 years before. And then SARS-2 is almost identical to SARS-1. All of this is known genetic territory. For this reason, very simple to make a diagnostic test, because we know the sequence already before the virus emerges. But this is decades of basic, let's say, biological diversity research that is not, let's say, funded in the public health programs. It's basic virology research. And this virus family approach, so these were family trees. This is traditional in making diagnostic tests. This approach is being followed there since decades. But we have few formalized and coordinated international programs towards preparedness research in diagnostics. I don't know whether you spotted this in Anna Maria's slide, but this bar of gaps to be filled was the biggest in the diagnostic section. There is just not so much attention. There's also this perception that we have these public health institutes, they are responsible for doing this, so this is already being taken care of. When it comes to a serious situation, there are quite some gaps. And the impediments, of course, are regulation, market interests, platforms, intellectual property, but this, in fact, is just the same as in vaccines and drugs. So we should really have a look at this. So technically, what we do to put this in life and to really implement this is technical validation of, for instance, here, analytical sensitivity, or here, what we call exclusivity testing, the analytical specificity to show that the new test is not cross-detecting other similar pathogens or similar disease-causing pathogens. This is what diagnostic labs actually need to be confident about such a test. So they need more than just a recipe, they need validation data. So this is what you actually have to put the work in. It's nowadays not the design of such a test because we have all the genetic knowledge. We have to validate this. So we need a collection of samples that are real. We need to operate a real diagnostic lab and not only work on the basis of some expert requests sometimes. So this has to be on the basis of a massive diagnostic business in the background. And then if you have this data, the validation data, the support, and the trust in the community, you can implement this quite rapidly. So in Germany, for instance, we had by the beginning of March, fake, WHO fake, end of January, beginning of February, the big alert, and then a month later, we have it installed across the country of 83 million people, many, many provinces. We were able to resolve the incidents in the country based on the minor province level, because it's all available. And this has a big impact in public health, in pandemic intervention. If you, for instance, compare the government stringency indices between the UK and Germany, I like to compare UK with Germany because similar structure, similar population size, but different political approaches, and wonderful data science in the UK, but bad political take-up at that time. quite the other way around compared to Germany. So in Germany, our wave arrived somewhat later than in the UK, but our reaction was somewhat more on spot. And in the end, we can say that relative to the beginning of the first wave, we reacted about 3 weeks earlier than the UK with measures that were, as you can see from the stringency data here, in the end, on the peak, were milder and they lasted shorter. And only because we spotted, because of the diagnostics, our first wave in the lab, rather than 3 weeks later in the ICU, we saved about 60,000 lives in the first wave with quite mild and shorter measures. This is just because of diagnostic test availability and of political take-up of the message of science, obviously. But the message of science and public health is very hard if you have hard detection data, right? So we could then scale up and convince the funding parties and the health service funders that we need capacity. We had a detection fraction of 10% based on symptoms-related testing by beginning of April, and you see how this capacity grew. This is a comparison against some other leading countries in testing. You see how Germany was very early with high capacity. I put these dots in because Germany didn't make notification at this time, so data science not good in Germany. And you see other countries that then ramped up considerably. Yeah? So this, for instance, is Denmark, one of the leading countries in testing. We have one new impediment, which is the IVDR in the EU, and this is the point I want to make about regulation. So we can also overly regulate the situation, especially when it comes to pandemic preparedness. So it's good that we have quality control in place. However, the upcoming new IVDR, so the in vitro diagnostics regulation of the EU, will really put hurdles towards pandemic preparedness because we need CE certified tests as a medical service provider now by law. This will be in force very soon. There is no exception for the case of a pandemic. That doesn't mean we can't respond, but the legal requirements are so complicated that really lab leaders are completely uncertain currently. And alone this causes delays in case something happens. And then to show what you can do with it, for instance, this is the first cluster that was really followed up in Europe, outside China, a case introduced in Munich in Germany and then followed up by available methodology. So the lab there locally was completely operational by end of January, and they could involve us as a confirmatory lab. And you find very important things here. For instance, pre-symptomatic transmission as a proof, not only as a statistical inference from transmission pairs, but as a lab proof based on sequencing. Yeah, so this is time elapsing, and you have a patient here transmitting the virus here to this patient 2 days before the symptoms in this patient even begin. Yeah, so this is always the day of symptoms onset with time going down. So this patient here is sick on this day, but 2 days before he meets or she meets this patient, what they do is they sit in a canteen back to each other, and this one asks this one, "Can I have the salt shaker, please?" And they transmit, and what they transmit is a virus that has a mutation, one single nucleotide polymorphism in the genome that occurs in the throat, but not the lung of the donor patient, and is then transmitted to the recipient and then makes up the whole transmission chain south of this patient. Yeah? So we have proof, lab proof, that this disease is transmitted before symptoms onset. And there is a lot more that you can derive that's extremely essential, and that is then summarized in so-called first few hundred cases protocols. These are an important public health measure, how and what you record from the first few hundred patients in a pandemic. So for instance, mutation rate estimates to see how fast the virus evolves, how often it is transmitted. Recombination frequency, transmitted virus dose, because the more virus is transmitted per human-to-human transmission event, the much more likely it is that the virus will rapidly adapt. This is really what drives virus evolution. It's the transmitted virus dose, it's not the mutation frequency. Then the question of co-circulation, transmission chains, and the whole issue of phylogeny, file geography, who is transmitted whom, from where was the virus brought in, and so on. And there is a lot of guidance to this, already written up on 8th of January 2021 by WHO. This is a very recommendable document that I can really recommend everybody to read, Genomic Sequencing of SARS-2. So then the sequencing was scaled up massively across industrialized countries. You can see how by January 2021, the Omicron wave, the effort peaked. You can see how low influenza sequencing was and still is compared to this. So this was like really a one-time effort, and we should look at this. So what was done? So what was sequencing during COVID-19 actually used for? We have to be aware of this to decide next time whether we need it, again, in this scale. So variant proportion tracing and national surveillance programs. To know, this week we have 30% of variant alpha against wild type, and we will be there in 2 weeks from now, and then the whole behavior of the alpha variant will take over our epidemiological situation, increased transmission in this time. So that was the perception in January 2021 when alpha swept Europe, starting from the UK. We have a lot of information that is fed into trials from sequencing. So that would be like variant-specific hospitalization rates to enhance healthcare-related forecasting and decision-making. So if we see the new variant brings more people to hospital, we know that given the same incidence, we will need more hospital capacity soon. That's worth knowing. But do we need 20,000 sequences per week, per country? No. We need about a few hundred maximum per week. Then variant-specific vaccine effectiveness. This has really informed the, let's say, the previous notice that we will have to adapt vaccines in time to come. Yeah. So this is very important. And then public health practical questions like, if we open during the European soccer match the stadiums, where will the virus show up if we do this across the UK? Well, the answer is we now know it showed up across Europe and across the UK, and it also increased the hospitalization rates again. Fortunately, at this point, already with the up-ramp of the vaccination campaigns, this was when Delta was circulating. We know this for sure, based on sequencing. But we should also be aware of what sequencing in this setup does not do. It does not detect viruses. We need the whole diagnostic PCR lab set up, the whole networks in the background. Otherwise, the whole sequencing muscle is stretched just for gymnastics. Yeah? We do not identify unknown pathogens because this is informed sequencing. This is primer PCR fragment-based sequencing. It's not de novo sequencing without a hypothesis. So this is not virus discovery. Don't confuse this. We will not identify virus changes such as immune evasion, transmissibility changes, virulence changes. This is not in the data. This comes from the virological lab, and then only after we've characterized this or after we've studied this in well-designed clinical or public health cohorts, we can say from the sequence information we can now go back. And also, it does not predict risks in absence of these complex data sources. So actually the study structures, the public health cohorts, this is what we need. Then we can have the same information, probably based on less sequencing. And this is an investment question, of course. And then I would touch on a third point, which is information. So the question, evaluation, what have we learned? Non-pharmaceutical interventions, what were they good for? So we had predicted and modeled information early on. For instance, this published in autumn of 2020 in Science, available as a preprint in early summer, the reduction of the RT value based on different major non-pharmaceutical intervention measures that you can see here. And also after the event. Now, for instance, the fabulous evidence synthesis activity of the Royal Society initiative, where we exactly know which of the measures now have support based on the quality filtered world literature of applied public health research. So we know this for sure. We didn't know a lot in the situation, and this we have to be clear about. This, for instance, is notification data by the Robert Koch Institute, the National Public Health Authority in Germany. 75% of all outbreaks couldn't be traced to a source, right? So we can only argue about 25%. So in the situation, we have very little information from day-to-day surveillance. We only have the bigger scientific concept like modeling studies early on, and then after action reviews, evidence synthesis later. So the big dimension, and against this, we have the big dimension of, I don't know what to make of this, right? Of door openers for disinformation that unfortunately are part of science. These are, so I've at some point called these people pseudo-experts, not in bad intention. I was severely attacked and I keep being attacked, but they are pseudo-experts because they are experts in something else. They are very good scientists, but in something else. And they shouldn't comment on things that they are not working on. But they did. They collected signatures. They had big economic interest groups in their back. Some of them are working now with think tanks. Some of them have become political, and it doesn't stop. This is an infection of our field that we have to control, or we will lose not only the war on information, but also the war for public health that we are all fighting in our jobs. Okay, so regarding this information, just to summarize this, initial decision-making in a pandemic will always rely on domain expertise and analogies, because a new pandemic virus will be a new virus. There is no evidence. It's not that there is somebody from the evidence research area who knows better than those people who are actually in the public health field. They work on experience, and this experience has proven right in, I would say, 98% of instances, looking at the whole issue after the event. Public health and data science will again compete with misguidance and disinformation for public and political attention, and scientists will again act out of social engagement, solidarity, and responsibility, and basically without any protection. So my last slide about science communication and policy advice, we need public advice coming from public health institutions. The function of big public health institutions has been undervalued during the pandemic. It is true that persons provide credibility if they are credible persons. And to make them credible, the institutions of science have to moderate conflicting opinions so that science-guided public health messages is not happening in talk shows. We need group advice with transparency. For instance, we could record advisory groups, we could record minority votes, and we need to visibly delineate advice from political decision-making to protect scientists. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christian, for this very comprehensive and informative presentation. I think you also highlighted very well that we need to strengthen the detection to response pipeline to ensure we can identify quickly and then we can respond quickly, and that will be the only way we can contain an outbreak, which we couldn't do with COVID. But it's the aim when we have few hundred cases of a disease X coming up. So it will be important to highlight this. And you mentioned some gaps, but I was wondering whether you can say a bit more about key challenges we need to tackle in Europe. Or you mentioned already the regulatory aspects. Maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, well, I mean, Europe is a complex entity that has many national member states, and this creates fragmentation, and this creates regulatory challenges, regulatory diversity. There's always a challenge of its own. And we have, let's say, the challenge to use the diversity for the good rather than the bad, right? So, I mean, one example I've somehow implicated also during the talk, we had excellent data science in Germany, in Europe, but only in a few countries. We should mention, obviously, Denmark and the UK. Many countries in Europe actually really strived on these data, really used these data for their week-to-week decision making, and we would have been quite blind for predictions if we hadn't had this great data science. On the other hand, we had other countries that were on the spot when it came to decision making and implementation of measures. Germany could be mentioned here. There are some others. And let's say in an after-action review on a European level, what one could do would, of course, be look at the diversity of these systems in a comparative manner and draw conclusions that you couldn't draw from other systems, because there is, of course, good infrastructure, there is, of course, good record keeping. We should make something out of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, so you should right now advance and go to the poll. Yes.
Are we having the poll? Yes, we're having the poll. Okay, good. So just to measure the temperature in the room, we will have a poll, so you can use your Skype app and open up the Slido. And the first question is, in your view, what pathogen is most likely to cause the next pandemic?
Be aware that you...
So you need, yes, of course, just one word.
Yes.
Not to, even if the pathogen is 2 words, you just still use hyphen. Just one word. Thank you. It's closed.
It's closed.
Is it open now? Okay, good.
Okay.
So, in your view, which pathogen is most likely to cause the next pandemic?
I know what they're going to say. I think it's going to be H5N1.
Not yet.
It has tried for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing yet.
Okay, maybe we have the results. Oh, influenza
yes.
is the big winner. Well, it was a safe bet, given that it has already caused many pandemics in the past. But there are also many candidates, other candidates, which highlights actually the Pathogen X approach. The unpredictability.
I think
From outer space.
A lot of avian influenza is and there is one, yes, okay.
Donald Trump is also on this.
Yeah, he is.
Very well, thank you very much.
Very creative.
This is great.
just stay
Oh,
very...
he's there. Okay.
It highlights, I think, the unpredictability of our times and of how we should look at it from a Pathogen X approach. So thank you very much. And then the second question is, how well do you feel in your current role that you are prepared to deal with a disease X scenario if it comes? So 1 is not prepared and 5 is well prepared.
Not prepared. It's going to win. Somewhat prepared.
Okay, maybe we can see the results.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not too bad. Somewhat prepared, around half of us.
Lots of optimistic people in the room.
Better than nothing. But we hope that Disease X will still leave us some time to prepare before it hits.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please go ahead.
You know what is the difference between an optimistic person and a pessimistic person? An optimistic person believes everything is possible. And the pessimist is the same optimist but well informed.
Great.
So thank you very much. And maybe we can close the poll and go directly to the Q&A because we only have 15 minutes left. So,
Yeah.
Luísa,
And
go ahead.
I think that also for Mika, we would like to pose a question. And the question is related with this pathogen X, this disease X, there is already ongoing. What do you think are the major gaps right now in terms of preparedness that you can identify? It seems that most of the audience think that they are already in a certain way prepared, but what you think about could be the major gaps in terms of this preparedness?
Well, depends, of course, if you look at it globally or regionally or in a country. But I would say that there is maybe not enough cooperation between different sectors. And I'm thinking here about One Health Corporation, for example. And it has to be sort of regular and almost daily for it to actually then work in a situation where we have a pandemic situation, and not just between the health and the animal health sector or food production, because if you look at the previous pandemic, this was not just a health crisis; it was a comprehensive, global societal crisis because it affected everybody in multiple ways. So I would highly encourage everybody to form the links to other sectors, even those that you don't think have anything to do, because they will have to do something. We advise every single sector in society during the pandemic, and I think that's the experience from many others also. So build those links in peacetime, exercise, understand that exercises are always a little bit naive and a little bit sort of optimistic, but they are still useful. You will have to improvise always, partly. And then maybe the last thing is invest in science, because I completely wholeheartedly agree with Christian that we need to have the information that we don't know is the important information. That only comes through science.
Okay, many thanks. Martin, please, any question from the audience? For sure that we have...
Thank you,
several.
Luísa.
Okay.
Yes, there are many,
Yeah.
but I'm going to be democratic, so the ones with the most votes or thumbs up I'm going to lead with. And perhaps I can do it like this. I'm going to tell you what the 3 top questions are, and then maybe between you can decide who's going to answer which one. So the top question is, are we focusing too much on pathogens and too little on humans in pandemic preparedness? What if we increase infection prevention and control in healthcare now, increase staffing and establish better outreach to most vulnerable populations? This could reduce the disease burden now and help to protect in the future. That's one question.
Okay.
Next top question. What are your thoughts on the avian influenza situation, specifically regarding the recent cases in Canada and the US? How worried are you? And given that I live in Canada, I would be a little bit self-interested in the answer to that one.
For Christian.
And then an interesting question I'm going to include here. It's directly related to the fur breeding association situation, but maybe it can be extended. To what extent can organizations or institutions be penalized? Oops, it's just moved. Hang on. That's the trouble with this app. Just as I was reading it, now it's gone.
Don't worry.
Here we go. To what extent can organizations be penalized for inadequate measures to prevent outbreaks?
Okay, so many thanks. I think that Mika already offered for the first question. So please.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an excellent question, because I have to say that one of my greatest frustrations during the pandemic was, and also maybe the messaging around it was that, we knew early on that this is coming. We cannot stop it. We can mitigate. We can brake. We can do everything we can to get the vaccines done, but especially in the beginning, we didn't know that they would actually work. We were extremely lucky, and also lucky in that we had the science that fit with it. But there was too little emphasis on the fact that when the people start getting sick, we need a very sort of strong healthcare system. And I think in our country, I think we lost half a year where we could have invested more in building the healthcare system stronger. And I actually was missing that advice a little bit also on the international level to prepare for the storm that was inevitably coming. So yes, I think we should do that. And one of the problems in politics and in society is that for the healthcare system, it's expected that it's going to be extremely efficient from a sort of cost base. You should have cost-effective interventions. You should have just the right amount of doctors and nurses, nothing extra. And that's a problem when you have a long-term crisis. For the militaries, we have all the staff, and actually they don't have anything to do except exercising all the time, unless there's a war, which nobody wants. So we should acknowledge that and put 10-20% extra in the healthcare system, so that when there's a crisis, we have a little bit of leeway. That's easier to say than to actually do that, but I think still that should be done.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Yes, I think that just Anna-Maria, you want to just compliment?
Yes, I just want to say, of course, we are here in Europe talking about the European perspective, but since pandemics will affect all of us, I just want to say from the WHO perspective, resilient health systems are very important. Absolutely. Having a global architecture that allows what I was said of communication, coordination, transparency in science, but also in public health is critical. But also, we have to be realistic. Sometimes infection prevention control, like for a disease like Mpox that transmits person to person, sounds easy here, you isolate. But if you are living in a compound in Africa where your entire family shares one room, and this one room is in a compound where other members of your extended family live, talking about infection prevention control is a challenge, because you have to bring the soap, the towels, the clean sheets, the possibility of changing clothes, and isolation. So this is why in WHO we always say that one should not go for one intervention. For example, not only vaccines or not only treatments, but an integrated approach to disease control is what is really important. And it's important not only my example of an African village, but also in Europe. And in some of the countries in Europe, the failure and there was mentioned a little bit during the presentations, was that some of the public health systems gave up on some of the interventions. So they gave up on the diagnostics, or they gave up on the contact tracing, and they focused mostly on the hospital admissions. Some of them gave up on the community engagement and the good communication skills that had been mentioned here. So the success of a control of an outbreak, so that it doesn't become a public health emergency of international concern and then leads to a pandemic, is that integral approach to introduction of medical and non-medical contrameasures.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Many thanks. And maybe now the second question to Christian.
H5N1.
The influenza.
H5N1, yes.
Yeah, so this is an interesting example of how many people are worried, and it's a matter of reporting and data transparency and so on. So in Canada, the case is a young person, and the virus is not the virus that's being passed around in cattle breeding in the US. It belongs to the same overall virus clade, but it's not this part of the diversity that is transmitted currently in these milk farms. So it must have been acquired from an avian source, from birds. That's the, say, concerting thing. What's a bit disconcerting is the severe disease presentation. So this is a young person, very sick. And that's a reminder, of course, of what H5N1 is actually presenting like when it's adapted to mammals, to humans. It's not this mild disease with some conjunctivitis and else not very severe symptoms that you now see in exposed people in the US, in the few that are now somehow reported in studies. But it's really more like the severe infection with a trend towards systemic spread. And what's also a bit worrisome is that this virus already has some adaptive mutations. Actually, for the virus in cattle farms in the US, there is less adaptation. You probably are all aware about this fact that there are tissue elements in the udder of cows that are more avian-like, so it seems the virus has less pressure to adapt, can still be transmitted with avian properties there, while this individual in Canada had in his virus already some adaptive mutations. I have no information about the case in California. Other people may be better informed. I have no information about the virus there in this case.
So, and we have just the last question, because I don't know if which of you want to answer answer this last question, Martin.
It's a theoretical question that basically if an organization is found to have been lapse and helped cause an influenza, what measures could be taken against them?
Yeah, but I think the question is how do you build a case and the accusation that a given farm with certain animals caused it. Because it's true that there are certain spillover events that are favored by the conditions in which the animals are and their interaction with humans. And we heard a bit about the fur farms and how there may be some conditions that may facilitate, but spillover events could come randomly also from sporadic interactions and so that's the first part. The second part is, I think it is very important that WHO has worked a lot with different partners on One Health, and one part of One Health is also the conditions in which animals are maintained, the monitoring of that, and also the well-being of these animals in these conditions so they don't favor transmission. And then finally, I think that what was presented from the experience of Finland of countries becoming more and more aware of the need to regulate and to facilitate and encourage evaluations and conditions that reduces the risk is a trend. And this is why we think, and when Christian was talking about people who wants to go to the jungle and find the virus that will cause the next pandemic, it resonated with me as an epidemiologist, because it is like if you are in Latin America and you see noises like horses walking and you think of zebras. You have to consider that probably it's a horse that is going to be the cause of the problem and not the zebra if you are in Latin America. So in a way, we sometimes are paralyzed by the idea that we should have huge surveillance systems for genomic versus a pragmatic approach that some call a smart surveillance to be able to monitor it.
Yes.
So I also think that regulation or penalization is not always the solution, because it leads to people being less likely to report, less likely to cooperate, and you have to consider all these.
Yes, and also in the EU there are regulations and directives to protect the workers in occupational settings, and we of course need to adhere. So there are regulations that we need to follow.
Yes, I think that
from the animal side, from the human side, and that is important.
That is the best approach to provide the guidance so they can implement measures to reduce the risk.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you very much. I think we need to close. Unfortunately, we have 38 seconds, but we can take it also in the chat if there are more insights from your side. Please go ahead and add them there. Sure. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to the audience for the active participation, to our speakers for all their comments and insightful presentations. and hand over to Luísa to close.
Yes, yes, many thanks for our speakers. It was really a very engaging and interesting session, and also many thanks to you. I think that there is hope because you stay here, you are quite interested in the topic, and we need the collaboration of all of us to push initiatives to prepare for the next pandemic. So many thanks.